Okay, great. So, this is the first seminar for the life term. So welcome everyone to this meeting, to the seminar. Our speaker today is Charlotte, who's a postdoc working with Forestry, and he's going to talk today about quantifying changes in AGB, degraded resource forest. So, yeah, I think thank you. What yours?
Surprisingly apt, given a meeting that I just had with Keshav, Amelia, and David and Ping this morning. But when Keshav asked me to do a talk to a group of computer scientists, and I started my career as a field ecologist, so I was a bit stumped as to what to talk to you about, because I spent a lot of time in rainforest measuring trees with tape measures and use remote sensing really as a tool to understand and scale up the forest plot data. So I'm deliberating, because I've also not been with the 4C team for that long that I have any results to show you either. So instead of giving you a real background into the restoration work I have been doing in the past, I thought I would talk about some of the stuff I am working on related to biomass mapping and measuring change in forests. So that's why I've chosen to talk about this topic, and I mean, hopefully you find it interesting. So I'm just going to kind of talk a little bit about why we need to map changes in biomass, a little bit about what forest degradation is, in case you're not really aware of that, and talk a little bit about restoration, some of the challenges we have with mapping biomass change within these degraded and restored forests, how radar data can be used as a tool to map biomass and some of its limitations. I'll give you some examples of projects that I've worked on where we've looked at mapping with radar, and then some of the methods that I'll be testing within 4C to try and move beyond just using radar data in a sense of doing this sort of quantification. So, why do we need to map biomass and biomass change? Am I in the way? Okay. So obviously, as I'm sure you're all aware, deforestation and forest degradation is very widespread, with net forest loss somewhere in the region of 4.7 million hectares per year. There are a lot of products that do a pretty good job of mapping changes in forest cover, so deforestation. So this is the Bankruptcy data set that you might remember Amelia is working on. I'm going to talk to you about it a fair amount. And it does a pretty good job of mapping like forest loss in terms of deforestation and looking at where regrowth is. So you can see intact underserved forests in green, and these orange areas are deforested at some point between now and 2000. But in terms of biomass change, these products are really looking at land cover change. We want to look at how much carbon is being emitted or sequestered from the atmosphere. And we do need to look at it from both of those directions. We have fluxes of carbon into the atmosphere from land use change, and also removals of carbon from the atmosphere from forest regrowth. So we need to look at both of these fluxes. Emissions from forest loss are somewhere in the region of 2.2 petagrams of carbon per year. So it's 2.2 billion tons of carbon. And some estimates, various papers would put emissions from degradation at about 2 to 10 times greater than deforestation emissions. And that is quite an unquantified source of emissions, so something that we really don't have a very good handle on. And we also need to understand how much carbon is being sequestered from these restoration interventions, as these are being done as a means of mitigating climate change. So obviously, if we want to know if we're doing a good job and if we're actually making an impact, then we really need to be able to put a number on how much carbon is being sequestered and make sure that we are balancing these different fluxes. So I just wanted to put a little segue into degradation, because some of you probably might not really know much about it. So deforestation then is the total clearance of forest. So you have your biomass stock at time 1, and then everything is gone, and you've got dead trees, and there's no biomass. Degradation then is slightly different to that. It's the removal of trees within a forested area that causes a reduction in biomass, but the area that remains as forest after that removal. So you have a really intact forest at the beginning, a few trees are taken, but you still have a closed canopy, a few more trees taken, canopy might open up, but you still have what would be classified as a forest afterwards. Now, degradation can be a gradual process and it can be ongoing. So the same place can be degraded multiple times. And there's still canopy cover, which makes it more challenging as a process to map. These changes can be large, so that can be the removal of big trees and lots of them. So if you're doing selective logging, for example, you cut down big trees, you have a lot of residual damage, like there's a bit of a domino effect when you cut these trees down. Or they can be really subtle, they can be sub-canopy, it can be the removal of understory trees for planting of crops. So things like shade-grown coffee, which we all like to drink, and cocoa, which we all also and also harvesting fuel wood in parts of the tropics. But essentially, the key thing here is in deforestation, you have a change in land cover class, and in degradation, you have no change in land cover class. And that is why this is a challenging process. I don't want to go too much into restoration. It's, you know, I could probably do an hour's talk on it, but I'm not going to. But just to kind of pull in what this is, as opposed to the other process I've just mentioned, restoration is undertaking some sort of active management intervention to try and recover forests. This differs from natural regrowth, where you're just letting forests that have been disturbed regenerate under their natural processes. It's doing some sort of activity to try and accelerate that rate. And somewhere in the region of 0.7 to 1 billion hectares of land across the globe are being committed for restoration. So huge areas. And those estimates say it's somewhere around 100 petagrams of carbon could be sequestered by the end of the century. So massive amounts of carbon as well. But that really does mean that we need to quantify these numbers, make sure that these targets are meeting the expectation. We understand how much is being sequestered, especially in light of this Guardian article that we probably, some of you may not have read this week. It's quite a big headline. David, you've got great quotes in there. But, you know, essentially, whilst this is looking at avoided deforestation projects, the premise of it holds true, that carbon sequestration and the amount of credits that are being issued for these projects is not being done properly. Which is the entire premise of the 4C project. It's like we need to get a better grasp on the carbon that is being exchanged in these systems. So I just want to move on to then SAR data and how that might be a tool to allow us to map biomass. So at its simplest, we get a radar signal, transmission from a satellite. So it comes in, it hits these surfaces and it interacts with them. That signal then returns to the sensor, backscatter, and it's used to estimate biomass. Because that signal increases as biomass increases quite conveniently. We have different types of scattering across different types of surfaces. So we can have this volume scattering that we've seen here in number 1, where the signal comes in, hits lots of diffuse surfaces and goes all over the place. We also have specular reflection, which is when, particularly on water or very flat surfaces, signal hits and goes completely the opposite direction, which is why radar is also great for mapping flooding, inundation in forests, and things to do with water and land use. And the thing we're particularly interested in for mapping the biomass is this double bounce. So it hits a tree, which hits the ground, which returns to the satellite. And that happens a lot in forests because we have lots of trunks. And we also have different sensors that can measure forest structure. I think probably you went over this a little bit during the talk by Jerome Chav last time, but just to kind of summarize, different sensors have different wavelengths. We go from X band, 3 centimeter, C band, which is 6 centimeters. So currently we have the Sentinel-1 mission, which is C band that comes around every 6 days or so. L band, which is what I'll mainly be discussing, is about 25 to 28 centimeters. That is the ALOS pulsar missions from JAXA. And P band, which interacts more with bigger trunks of very big trees, because it goes through the canopy, interacts with the trunks, whereas L band is more big branches. These are the main sensors that we're looking at. So in terms of the opportunities for biomass mapping, as I said before, degradation can occur below the canopy and in regions with persistent cloud cover, which means that optical data often isn't suitable for these sorts of measurements, because that really is just surface reflections. So whilst there are certain ways of looking at changes in canopy cover that might be related to degradation through Landsat, it can't pass through canopies through clouds, and it can't pass through the canopy. So using radar is a great opportunity for that, and it interacts with your forest structure. These degradation events are often also really small. It can be of less than a hectare, so it might be a single tree that's cut down. And again, optical sensors that are being used to map degradation often look at changes in canopy cover. So that's really only going to be looking at big changes which relate to an actual change in canopy cover that's related to a heavy degradation event. So we probably won't be capturing these smaller events particularly well. And as I said, this backscatter signal is correlated with biomass, so we can produce maps. However, that signal does saturate. So with L-band, saturates about 150 tonnes per hectare. So in low biomass forests, that's like dry forest woodlands, that's not a problem. But in tropical moist forests, obviously that can be an issue. And also when we're looking at annual recruitment and accumulation of biomass within these restored forests, we're interested in how fast forests are regrowing. Accumulation can be, it's not, I wouldn't call it slow, but it's relatively low value, to maybe somewhere around 2 to 5 tonnes per hectare per year is being accumulated. But annual change can often be lower than the uncertainty in your mapping products. So trying to pick apart what is error and what is actual growth is really difficult. And currently the free ALOS data that is available is only an annual mosaic. It is a much more frequently passed sensor, but if you want the more high quality data, you have to pay. I mean, one could argue that that's not really a problem because measuring biomass change in anything more than a year is a bit bizarre. But I mean, it's still something to bear in mind because you obviously lose a lot of the detail in the data by it being mosaicked. And also this P-band sensor by ESA is still not up. And apparently it's now delayed, another 2 years? Yeah, 2024 now. So we still haven't got much, much hope in using that for a little while to map these really big forests. So, we need to think of other ways in which we can map high density forests. So I'm just going to go on to 2 projects that I worked in while I was at Edinburgh University. We were trying to understand if we could develop methods that we could apply and try and understand the limitations of ALOS. So we worked in, the first example I'll give you is from Jalisco State in Mexico. So this is Jalisco here, in central Mexico. On the coast, we have these 3 different study areas. And the green points here are some of the plots. There are a few here as well. We were working in this region. Now this is a pine oak dominated forest. It's quite dry, and that means that it's affected by fires. So you can see here some of the forest workers trying to help extinguish some of the fires that are burning. And these are kind of low level fires, a lot of them, but we have a lot of burnt stems, and you can see that a lot of mortality within these forests is because of fire. And they also have a real big problem in the past decade from a pest, which is a bark beetle. So you can see these orange crowns here. These are dead trees that have been infected with this beetle and need to be felled to stop the spread of this pest. And these often go hand in hand. Areas that are kind of stressed because of fire have a much higher incidence of pests. And also this area is hugely important for avocado production. It's expanding very, very rapidly in the region. So lots of potential threats. So in this project, we had this sort of general framework for our methods. We were going to have forest plots that we censored throughout time, so we understand what is happening on the ground in these forests, what stems are being lost, how much biomass is being lost. We will have ALOS data for the corresponding time steps. And then we will perform a regression analysis to calibrate the radar data and create a equation to convert backscatter into biomass. And obviously we can do that for multiple time steps to estimate change. So in the study, we had about 18 plots that were trial, that were measured twice. And throughout these plots, we had lots of evidence of burning. So here you can see the field team doing a lot of measurements. And here we have all these kind of burnt coals and a very open landscape, which is not really how it's supposed to look. So what we did then, this is just data from one of the years, but we plotted the biomass from the plots against the backscatter, and you can see this is quite a nice relationship. As biomass increases, the backscatter also increases. So to get the biomass values from this, we took all height measurements, height, diameter, all of the standard kind of forest structure measurements in the field, and we used the equation by Chav, who was here last term, to convert that into biomass. And this is actually quite a low diversity forest, so there's only about 5 species of pine and about 5 species of oak that really dominate 5% of the stems.
So you measure every single tree?
Every tree within the plots. We had 0.5 hectare plots, measured every single tree in the plots. And we also recorded the conditions. So we would take a record of whether it looked healthy, whether it was affected by fire, whether it had any affected by pests. I mean, there's if you look at the protocol from the rainfall network, there's a lot of information about how you measure kind of tree health. So we took a lot of measurements of that to sort of understand, okay, well, we seal this tree and it looked like it was burnt, and then we come back a year later and now it's dead. So we have some sort of causal idea of why that tree might have died. But essentially we have these biomass estimates for every single plot at 2 time points, and we can estimate biomass change. So of these 10 plots here that I just put up, because 4 of them have lost biomass. 1 completely was clear cut and turned into avocado, and we weren't able to access the land anymore. But obviously we can say that's full deforestation because it is no longer forest and it's now growing lots of tasty avocados, but at the expense of some nice forest.
Did you plot AGB change against backscatter change? Does that work?
I have done that in other places when this didn't work, to see if that would work. It kind of does to an extent, but the relationship between biomass and HV backscatter is better. So I guess I didn't mention that we used ALOS, which has got both the HV and HH polarizations. And the HH is not so good for estimating biomass. HV has a much better relationship because it's a bit more affected by this double bounce effect that happens within forests. So the relationship, I haven't put up the HV relationship because it's much lower.
Do you think that is species specific? How do you shape of mitigation?
No, it is because you're looking at the structure, and I think that when it bounces, it changes the polarization. So I think it's something to do with that, and it's like hits the trunk, hits the ground, goes back, and so that happens a lot in forests where there's lots of trunks. You get a good relationship with, and a HH is more to do with canopy, and you can get some indices between the two, which sometimes have a good relationship, but in this instance it didn't. But yeah, anyway, so from this data we were able to develop a conversion equation to convert the backscatter into a nice biomass. So this is just in one of those 3 sites, Sierra del Tigre. The dotted areas are actually non-forest areas. I just show you the kind of biomass within forest zones. And then the following year, it looked like this. So you can see that there's like a bit of change. But we were able to map biomass change from these 2 points and actually have a map of the changing biomass. So the red colours show where there's biomass lost, and the blue where there's increases. And then The problem with this method is that radar is like an inherently noisy data set. So there is a lot of speckle within it. So sometimes looking at pixel to pixel changes can be somewhat challenging because you don't know whether the noise is a real signal or not. So we tend to trust clusters of pixels that have all changed more than an individual pixel that's changed and nothing around it has changed, because it kind of is more related to a trend in the forest landscape rather than noise.
What is it like?
It's basically saying that if you look at radar data, whilst at a very zoomed out layer view, you'll be able to look at patterns in like land use. But if you zoom in really, really carefully, it looks a bit granular. So it's like the static on your TV, like old school static. Like you just have like speckly noise. So you'll have big change. You can have big changes in pixel values from one pixel to the next.
High frequency noise.
Yeah, so it's always good to do filter. I mean, and I did do lots of filtering in this to sort of try and like reduce some of the noise signal. So often it's good to do sort of a kind of moving window averaging over your data to kind of remove some of that noise. But radar is just inherently quite noisy. Our loss is about 25 meters. Yeah, so it's quite a good resolution. We scaled it up to 1 hectare because it's easier to think about mapping biomass at a 1 hectare scale, because most studies do at a 1 hectare scale, and understanding what biomass change means at over a 25 meter pixel is a little uncertain. So this is, all these maps have been changed to a 1 hectare resolution. Sorry, I should have pointed that out. But because of the absolute change, we felt like it was a little uncertain in this analysis. What we did is grouped our data into these different degradation levels, so minor, moderate, and major degradation. So a minor degradation event was somewhere between a loss between 10 to 50 tons per hectare. Moderate was between 50 and 100, and major was over 100 tons per hectare. So you can see here, obviously, we have the green areas that are growing, and then we have this kind of yellow to red kind of alert color system to point out the degradation. And when we zoom in, we can see that there are some areas, it's a bit tricky to see on the zoomed out area, but if you zoom in on these areas, you can start to see some patterns emerging, where there's minor degradation events on the outskirts, moving towards areas that are being more heavily degraded. And this kind of would suggest that we are picking up on actual degradation, because it looks like there's some sort of pattern to it, and there's sort of lower levels of degradation happening on one front and a heavier degradation you're moving into an area of forest. But the thing that we found really was that these minor degradation events were far more common than these major events. So about 30% of our study area had undergone some minor degradation, whereas major degradation was only 0.3% of that area. So obviously these smaller changes are far more common than really big changes in terms of degradation. So we need to understand all of that, because a minor degradation here is still 10 to 50 tons of carbon. And if that covers a large area, then it's still a flux that we need to understand.
In the non-forest areas, is that the deforested forest, or is it?
No, there's a lot of green. So it might look like there's changes in biomass because there's plantations. So if they've got plantation, it looks like there's a big flux, but because then trees. So this isn't like the boundary of a protected area. It's the OLT Grazer Hill range, where they have just want to try and prevent degradation, but they know that within it there are areas that are already assigned to agriculture that aren't going to be converted back in any way. So this project was more about trying to pick up where degradation was happening and seeing if they could prevent it, because they knew that it was happening, and they wanted to know how much it was, how much were the emissions.
High degradation happens in the center, because you would expect it to have it at the edges, and the center to be less effective, right? Because if you want to take it out by a road, the road's going to be at the edge, not in the center.
Well, I mean, there aren't any roads on this map, so it may be that there are tracks that go through those kind of red areas. I agree with you, it does seem kind of odd, but the yellow pixels are closer to green areas, which is where forests are and they're regrowing. Whereas the red zones are generally only bordered by other degraded forests. But I mean, it would probably be useful if we also had maps of both the main minor roads and the forest tracks. Unfortunately, that data didn't exist at the time. Okay, so I'll move on to the next project. And then, oh, that's not Mexico, that is absolutely definitely Ghana. But we've also did a project in Ghana. And in the western and the Borongafo regions, which are so over here, we had 11 plots there, and these were slightly larger plots of 1 hectare, and they had been measured on many occasions since the mid-90s. And you might be able to see here in this map, but the forest cover remaining in Ghana is in very isolated patches. So these dark areas are the forest reserves, and everything around it is more or less cocoa or kind of degraded, heavily degraded forest and agricultural land. So what remnant forest there is really fragmented. But these are kind of much more moist tropical forests, and they're kind of known for being a lot higher biomass. This part of West Africa, the forest can have very high biomass. And it's really heavily affected by selective logging. So these photos on the right here, you can see some of the cut stems on the ground, very high invasion by vines into the forest that comes afterwards, and here as well. There's also understory clearance for this cassava here that's being grown, but also for bananas, and also expansion of shade-grown cocoa. And a lot of the clearance understories, because cocoa is so lucrative that most farmers put all of their land to cocoa and then use the forests for growing their subsistence crops. So we looked at biomass change across this 22-year time series. And in this case, the changes were much more dramatic. So some of these plots were losing over 100 tons of carbon per hectare, 60% of their biomass. And you can still see, though, after they've lost all of this biomass, they still have quite a lot there. So, this plot here lost 62% of its biomass, but it still has 116 tons on the ground, which is still quite a lot of biomass being stored in trees. But because it started a lot higher, it's like still got quite a lot there. And here's kind of where it all falls apart, because when we did the same thing here, we plotting plot biomass values against both HH and HB. There's not really any clear relationship between the plot data and the backscatter. And there's also this apparent downward trend in HB, which I just found really weird and didn't understand at all, but it's not, not really a very strong signal. So clearly we have this saturation signal that is going on. This is actually where we did look at biomass change and HB change, and again, there was just no relationship there. And considering, some of our plots looked like this is one of the plots. Like this is what some of our plots look like, and this radar signal isn't picking up that this no longer is a forest. This is now a degraded forest. It was, a bit worrying. Like big changes have happened here, so why are they not picking this up? I would also point out that these areas where these big changes are being picked up were also not being picked up by optical data because they were so green. So if you looked at these greenest indices, they still looked like forests, even though from the photos you can see quite clearly that that is not what they are. So when we just compare these two studies, that you can obviously see in these lower biomass forests in Mexico, we were able to pick up quite a nice relationship and use this as a technique. However, these plots were really invaluable to helping us understand what was going on, because we could really attribute loss to a cause. We knew that what the fire or pests or whatever it was was causing the death of individual trees. So you can actually that allows you to see what management interventions can be put into place to try and reduce those impacts. But in these high biomass forests, even these large changes weren't being picked up. And that is it is rather worrying, because as I showed in Mexico, it's the smaller events that are far more common. So if you're not even picking up the big events, then how are you supposed to be picking up the small events? So there's this huge flux of carbon into the atmosphere from this degradation that isn't really quantifiable through radar data or currently available radar data. And this is when the P-band would come in, because these are super high biomass forests. So the P-band data is designed to do mapping of biomass change in these sorts of environments. However, one of the trade-offs with these higher wavelength instruments is the higher resolution. So you have a 200-meter resolution pixel, so something around 4 hectares per pixel. And as I said, lots of these events can happen at a much smaller scale than that. So obviously we have to kind of find compromises. You can map big scale changes and patterns, but these smaller, finer, detailed events you're not going to be capturing. But then, so now I guess I wanted to talk about some of the ideas we're going to be testing in 4C, because obviously trying to use these techniques and widely applying them across the tropics isn't going to work. So we need to be looking at other types of instruments. And so obviously trying to look at JEDI and using LiDAR as a means to overcome some of these saturation issues. So I guess I'll just go through this sort of general workflow to summarize like what we think we're going to try and do to map biomass change. So the goal of my project within 4C is to try and look at quantifying carbon sequestration within restoration projects. So the first sort of thing we need to know then is where are forests being restored. So my first sort of task which I'm working on at the moment is compiling a database of restoration projects. So looking at pulling information from the Vera database and looking at Plan Vivo repository as well. And also looking at this restore database, see if there's any useful information there. And trying to basically get polygon data that sort of shows us where a forest is being restored. And then from the project information, we can understand what type of intervention was being put in place, the start date of the project, the land use history. And all of that information is important to understand, what's been going on in these landscapes. So that is sort of the starting point. And then we need to understand what the current biomass is. So essentially for what we need to quantify is biomass change since the start of the project. But the information that we have is biomass now. Some of these projects only started a few years ago, so we might be able to look at more recent biomass maps. But really what we need to know is the current biomass within project areas. So we'll probably be looking at this JEDI level 4B gridded data set. I might talk to Amelia about using the footprints as well, but essentially it's finding data about biomass within a given project area and trying to understand within that project what types of activities. So you have to kind of pull apart, reduce the size, and say, okay, we know that in this project, a certain part of it was planted in 1 year, and then another coop was planted the following year. So, we'll be further reducing our information with the more and more details that we get. But the thing that we need to do essentially is estimate a biomass recovery curve within these restoration projects. So I think that from what I showed you in the project in Mexico, looking at producing multiple biomass maps and looking at change is a little bit problematic because they do have errors within them. So using a baseline biomass map and estimating a rate of recovery and using that to estimate change is probably a more accurate means of making these estimates. So the idea then would be to find the JEDI shots within each time step in a project. So as I said, you can have a single project that did planting in a part of their project for any given year, and then another area for another year. So we need to make sure we understand the start date and find all of the footprints within each time step in the project and use that as an estimate of restoration age, and we can plot the biomass versus age within those projects, try and have a look at estimating a rate of biomass change across all the projects for a region, for example. We also then need to get a biomass curve in naturally regenerating forests. So these are forests that are recovering without any sort of management intervention. And this kind of follows some of the pipeline that Amelia's been developing, looking at regrowth in forests outside of these projects. And I guess we're going to be working on some of that together. But to estimate biomass change, essentially what we need to do is have these different recovery curves for different types of projects. And we'll apply our restoration curve to pixels within our project area. We'll apply our recovery curve to our counterfactual pixels in the outside of our recovery area and look at the difference between those two to quantify the additionality between a project area and an area which has similar characteristics but hasn't had any sort of management. And that these curves can be used to back extrapolate from current day biomass to biomass at the start of the project. So this is kind of like the ideas that we're going to be following. There's a lot of
this month ago, they got fine July shots for each time step in the project.
Mm-hmm.
But you know, July is only for 2 years, so how are you going to find the July shot for each time step?
Well, so what I mean by that is if we have an area in a project that was planted in 2018, say, we'll find all of the JEDO shots for 2018 and get with the biomass values. In the area next door that was planted in 2019, we can get all of the biomass values for that area that was planted in 2019 and treat them as independent points and plot them with their age. So you say, okay, now it's 2023, so we know the 2018 forest is 5 years. We know the 2019 forest is 4 years old, so we can plot age of regrowth versus biomass and do some regression analysis to try and.
That's assuming that you have this, you know, planting. Let's say they have planting happened in 2002 and 2004, then you wouldn't have the time theory.
No, but you would be able to then say we have the biomass values for this this year, and we know that that means, okay, we have 2023 biomass, and we know it's planted in 2000. So that is 23 years of regrowth that's happened in that point, and we have the current biomass. If we have somewhere that is planted in 2005 and we have the biomass from today or this year, then we
no, I understand. So you're going to space the time, but then
so
sure that the biomes are identical, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of problems about where the starting biomass is, whether we actually can use the starting year, the first year of planting as a proxy for forest age. And this is where I'm at now with my thinking and being like, okay, I've come across these problems and I need to start chatting to some people about how we overcome them, because I think at the moment what we're trying to do is understand, okay, the forest has this many tons of biomass. If it was regrowing, then where along this curve is it? But if we don't have a good handle on what it was at the beginning, then it can be tricky. So obviously, if we had projects that had estimates of starting biomass, then that would be really great, because it kind of puts some boundary on where we're working off. From experience, most projects don't do that. They calculate their baselines in very different ways. They don't collect data, or they don't report them in their project documents. So they don't say, you know, we are a degraded forest, and on average we have 100 tons of biomass per hectare as a starting point that we're working. So I think that is going to be a problem that we need to think of some interesting ways of solving. But essentially trying to mirror some of the stuff that Amelia's been doing in terms of looking at regrowth in the naturally regenerating forests, but using the restoration projects as the ground data. So we've got polygons, we know where things are going to be done. I think that there probably is a lot of projects that have only started in the last few years, so we might actually not have to worry too much about the starting biomass if we look at these more recent projects, and we might be able to actually get a value for their starting biomass. For older ones, I think it's going to be a challenge. So I need to kind of have a bit more. This is sort of my workflow since the first week in January. Like I've been working on pulling apart some of this, the project data and things like that. But I mean, yeah, so this is kind of a bit of an idea, but it's still kind of very vague and needs a lot of hashing out. So I'm not going to go on too much longer. Obviously, as I've shown you, it's important to measure these changes in biomass, particularly in light of climate change mitigation. It's a really challenging task. The suitability of data sources is not widely applicable to every type of forest, and different types of activities need to be considered when you're looking at doing this work. And I guess that's the goal of this project, is to try and test new methods and develop more widely applicable methods that can be used in all different types of forests, that hopefully won't be kind of over-reliant on sort of data that might be so have a kind of a bit of shelf life. It's not an easy task, I guess, is my overall conclusion. But yeah, that's it. So any questions, please go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, I mean,
Okay, well, thank you. Thanks for doing this talk. One thing that you talked to me about separately is about, like, you also looked at SAR data to understand kind of like roughness of forests. And then you could kind of distinguish between like a forest that's actually growing or a plantation, or you would get like much more roughness or texture in one versus the other. And I was wondering whether you had done any of that work in looking at degradation, the way that you text here, whether that had you connected those two, and whether the roughness stuff also saturates, or would it be potentially a way to detect types of degradation?
Yeah, well, so that was stuff that I started doing kind of after this project finished. And I was like, wow, it would have been a really good idea to have like been able to do that in Ghana, for example, where definitely these really degraded sites would have much more canopy roughness than a cocoa plantation, or probably an intact forest where you haven't got such changes in canopy height. I think that it would be a really useful way of trying to look at different types of forest. So like intact disturbed, kind of these flat topped plantations. I shouldn't think that the signal saturates, because it's really about it's really looking at variance between pixels. So, you know, your variance will either be really high or, you know, there won't be much. So I don't think that that signal should saturate, but again, I haven't actually tested it within this site. Thanks.
I'm just trying to work through the fact that the radar couldn't detect that degraded forest. And so the thesis is that there's a double bounce from trunks. And so given a plot of suitable resolution, it really should have correlated there, right?
Yeah.
And so I can imagine how you could use JEDI to spot the fact that it's lower in height in the not a forest. But it does seem concerning that you know, the double bounce, I mean, this isn't about holding it. So is there any way to look at some of those areas in more detail with the SAR and just sort of figure out exactly why on this forest?
Yeah, but one of the things that we didn't manage to fully account for is it's going is a little bit of the offset between the ALOS and the ALOS2. So there is a slight offset, and so we applied like a generic offset because we know that like they're not fully comparable. So basically looked at areas that weren't changing to see how different the signal was, to develop like an offset value, but it's probably that it's not consistent over space. So it might be that you need to have a bit more spatial variation in that offset value if you want to look at change over time. However, there was still like a bit of a poor relationship within a given time step out well. I mean, yeah, probably there is ways in which you can pull it apart a little bit, maybe look at indices between different polarizations, or maybe adding in these texture values, saying, okay, well, we aren't seeing this signal with the backscatter, but we can see that this canopy is very different to that canopy.
Yeah.
But I think that actually that's probably where Sentinel-1 would come in, because it's actually interacting a lot more with the canopy. So I think that Sentinel-1 probably would do a better job at looking at surface texture than ALOS, because that kind of passes through and does like branches. When you've got a very dense mess of degraded forests, then yeah.
But it's still good news. It's good news if you can put down a facial path to get more accuracy of where people are,
Yeah.
then the double trunk theory can still.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was also wondering if the soil humidity, soil moisture level might be partially changing the backdeck. You know, I don't know what I don't remember what the plan.
Yeah, and soil moisture does impact radar data for sure. That's more of a problem when you're looking at the full beam like data, rather than the annual mosaics, because the mosaics have already done a lot of pre-processing on it to remove the impacts of soil moisture. But it's definitely something you need to be aware of if you're looking at the full ALOS series and you paid for the actual data and you had data that was from the rainy season and the dry season. You're like, actually, there's a more soil moisture thing going on here that we need to account for. Yeah.
How much of data ABB measurements been validated in the field and their return? Yes, and then did they find any variation between kinds of forests kind of was
I mean, I haven't really started really exploring the JEDI data fully yet. It's something that I actually am really curious about, because my understanding is that they haven't been particularly well validated by lots and lots of ground data. I think I get the impression that the height stuff is a lot better than the biomass values. So I think it might be useful to try and just confirm with field data in projects that we've been working in how good the JEDI shots are at capturing what the biomass actually is, because that is an anxiety of relying on this data set and being like, this is going to be our truthing point. It actually doesn't do the best job, because I guess you're trying to convert tree height into biomass.
Something called like SDB, apparently someone has tried to compile like a validating database for JEDI. I haven't been exactly find the thing. I don't know what really looks like.
In some of these projects though, where we do have data, you could use the JEDI height data and develop your own biomass algorithm, because most of the plot data has tree height, so you can get plot level biomass values and relate that to the measured tree height, and then develop an algorithm to field-based height and use that to estimate biomass from JEDI height if you
How do you really do the measurements for the PGB? You give more data on that. How
if you have a forest plot, you go with a tape measure. You lay out your plot. So in a 1 hectare plot, you generally would lay out 20 meter subplots. You measure every single tree within your subplots, measure the diameter, tree height. You get the species, which gives you an estimate of wood density. If you're looking at permanent plots, then you also need to have a measure of like where they are. So just give each tree within the plot a coordinate. So you can track the individuals through time, and again look at like the health and conditions of those trees. So you have an indicator of whether things look healthy, whether they've fallen, whether they're snapped. If they look like they're in bad health and they might die soon. Just to give you an indication, if you go back a few years later and you can't find your trees, you're like, okay, well this one looked like it snapped in half, so it's probably died. It's like not looking in great shape. But essentially, yeah, you take all of these structural measurements of trees and then you use allometric equations to convert those measures into an estimate of biomass. And we know that those models aren't perfect for sure. There's massive errors on particularly large trees, because large trees are really hard to measure, and there's very few of them in the data sets for the allometric equations. And the big trees can hold, you know, like over 50% of your biomass. You know, so understanding the dimensions of those trees is and the errors in it is a problem, and converting that into biomass is tricky. Well, but I mean, that is definitely like the way that technology is moving to improve the understanding of plot data. Obviously, that's quite a technical piece of kit that's really expensive. I mean, they've definitely gone down. When I was doing my PhD, my colleague who I worked alongside was using a TLS, and it was like $200,000. So it just isn't accessible to the majority of people that need to do this. And it's also a very technical piece of equipment that requires a lot of data processing. So I think that really the utility of those is to develop algorithms where you can convert TLS data or like validate TLS data against plot data and say, okay, we've got these plot measurements, and what other algorithms, or, you know, can we develop equations that would convert by like these standard measurements into higher quality biomass estimates? Because, you know, most people can afford a tape measure. Very few people can afford a TLS or have the capacity to use it. And that's the thing, you need so many people on the ground to measure forests. But I mean, projects want to do this, they want to understand what is going on in their forest, and there's not really a substitute for doing it in terms of the biodiversity at the moment. I mean, obviously there's techniques with the hyperspectral that are being tested with biodiversity, but you also need to understand what species your signals are. So, you know, in terms of biodiversity, you still kind of need to. Maybe you disagree with me, Alan. I don't know much about hyperspectral like stuff.
Yeah, one interesting thing that we're for LiDAR like things that could be for phones, things like that, that could allow you to do some of this for a lot less money. The limitation of those is usually their range. So PLS, like these 200,000, 50,000, even what they are now, I think last we looked at $50,000. Like
Which is still like expensive.
Super expensive. They have got like a range and high accuracy at a range of like 50 meters, but you could potentially just have something that has a very short range and kind of walk it around and develop our boycott that way. Or you're limited because you can always look at the higher parts. So we did some work with that.
And then the paper on that going yesterday.
Oh, very technology is developing incredibly quickly, and I think that the utility of mobile phones in forests offline is very helpful. So, you know, with the advent of new technologies that are low cost, but the key is like low cost, because, you know, forest rangers cannot afford anything that is even in the thousands of dollars. So you need something that is like, oh, there's $100 it can get up after your mobile. So that sounds really cool, actually. I don't know about that.
Any Android.
Oh, that's cool. Yeah. Very nice.
Yep.
Good. Anything else?
We've exhausted
Okay.
everything.